California gold is just something else.
Yeah.
The mother lode of California, the nuggets that come out of there are just crazy.
In the dense, dangerous, and almost untouched forests of Canada, where even today many areas haven't been properly surveyed, Dan Hurd picked up a signal that everyone else had completely ignored. It all started with a small clue: heavy black sand along the water's edge, unusually chunky gold flakes, and instead of the usual 1 to 2 grams per pan, straight 15 to 20 grams coming out per pan. Right there, Dan realized, this spot wasn't normal. On the very first day, from just 25 to 30 test pans, more than 400 grams of gold was recovered in total. For placer mining, these numbers were almost unbelievable. Dan immediately started deeper digging. As the depth reached around 3 to 5 feet, the gold concentration increased even more. Some layers were giving 2 to 3 ounces per cubic yard, which was many times higher than the industry standard. But the real shock came when they mapped the entire area. The same pattern was repeating across a stretch of nearly 300 to 400 meters. Quick calculations showed that if this grade continued, the total recoverable gold could reach 120,000 to 150,000 ounces. At today's gold price, around $2,000 per ounce. That turns into a massive $240 million to $300 million discovery. Now the challenge was the location. No roads, no heavy setup. Still, Dan started operations with limited equipment, small wash systems, manual sorting, and controlled excavation. Daily recovery started averaging 80 to 100 ounces, and on some peak days it even reached 150 ounces. This wasn't just luck. It was a game of data, observation, and the courage to take risks. Dan saw what others couldn't, and that's what brought out a hidden $300 million system buried beneath the forest. If you want to know real numbers, massive gold discoveries, and the truth behind hidden treasures before anyone else, then subscribe to the channel now, because the next story might be even more shocking. That region of Canada, it shows up on maps, but in reality, it's still not fully understood. A remote forest stretching around 50 to 60 kilometers with no proper roads, and in the last 20 to 25 years, only 2 to 3 small surveys had ever been done there. Most miners had already rejected this area. The reason was simple: no solid data, no past production records, and no real proof that serious gold existed there. That's why it was labeled a low potential zone for years and left untouched. But Dan Hurd saw things differently. When he first arrived at the location, everything looked normal at first. Same gravel, same water flow, same terrain. But after just a few minutes of observation, things started to change. The black sand jump along the water was unusually heavy, so much that even a small pan was producing 200 to 300 grams of concentrate. In some places, the layering of rocks didn't match the natural flow direction, as if they had been brought from somewhere else and deposited there. The biggest signal came when Dan noticed the gold flakes. Normally, placer gold is light and thin, but here the flakes were thick and chunky. Some pieces weighed between 0.5 to 1 gram, which is very rare at the surface level. Dan immediately compared it. If such heavy gold is visible right at the surface, then the concentration below could be many times higher. He carefully scanned a stretch of around 300 meters, and surprisingly, the same pattern kept repeating again and again. And this wasn't a random spot. It looked like a continuous system. When Dan Hurd started properly testing that area, the first thing he noticed was the heavy black sand. Usually black sand is found with gold, but here its quantity was on a completely different level. Even in a small pan, around 200 to 300 grams of concentrate was coming out, which itself was a strong signal. But the real story began when Dan slowly washed that pan. As the water cleared, what appeared at the bottom changed everything. Not small flakes, but thick, heavy pieces of gold. Each pan was giving around 15 to 20 grams of gold. Now, if you compare that with normal mining, even 1 to 3 grams per pan is considered strong and a good spot. But here, the numbers were directly 5 to 10 times higher. Dan immediately understood. This wasn't a normal deposit. This was something different. He carefully observed the pattern in every pan. Each time the same type of gold, the same weight, the same consistency. That clearly meant this gold wasn't randomly washed in from somewhere above, but was coming from a concentrated source. In other words, somewhere below there was a strong system continuously feeding gold. Dan said to himself, "This gold wasn't random, it was giving a signal." Now this wasn't just observation anymore. It had become a clear direction. But instead of stopping there, Dan decided to confirm this signal. He started continuous test panning at different points in the same area. First 5 pans, then 10, then 20, and every time the result was almost the same. By the time 25 to 30 pans were completed, the total gold recovery had crossed 400 grams. These numbers were so big that even the crew went silent. One of them quietly said, "Many miners don't get this much gold in an entire week." The atmosphere had completely changed. To clear any doubt, Dan double-checked all the results, verified the scale, ran duplicate pans, and made comparisons. But every time the outcome was the same. Now it was clear that this wasn't just a lucky spot, but a large, consistent gold system. Dan Hurd wasn't just extracting gold anymore. He was understanding the ground. The repeated heavy flakes and consistently high numbers pushed him to think in one direction. This couldn't be a random surface deposit. Dan started studying old geological maps and river flow patterns. He compared where the current stream flows today and where it might have flowed thousands of years ago. And that's where a dangerous theory emerged. An old river channel, a buried path of a river that had shifted over time and is now hidden beneath the ground. Dan explained that when the river used to flow along its old path, it carried gold particles with it. Over years, maybe even thousands of years, that heavy gold slowly kept settling in specific spots. Because gold is heavy, it doesn't stop everywhere. It only settles where the water flow slows down, like bends, dips, or natural traps. And if that old channel later gets buried under mitti and rocks, the gold gem inside it can remain completely untouched. So the little gold visible on the surface was just a hint. The real treasure was inside that old buried channel. Dan said to himself, "What you see on top, that's not the real story." Now the theory was clear, but it needed proof. And for proof, digging was necessary. Dan started controlled digging at the same spot. In the beginning, they dug only 1 to 2 feet deep. The result was decent, but nothing special. But as soon as the depth reached around 3 to 5 feet, everything suddenly changed. The gravel layer shifted, the soil color changed, and most importantly, the gold quantity started increasing rapidly. Earlier, where pans were giving 15 to 20 grams, now the excavated material was yielding around 2 to 3 ounces per cubic yard. These numbers were almost unheard of in placer mining. Normally, a good deposit gives about 0.3 to 0.5 ounces per cubic yard. But here the output was many times higher. With every new layer, the crew was getting more serious. One worker picked up some material and said, "This ground isn't normal. It feels heavy." And it really did. The gravel had a noticeable weight, almost like it was filled with metal. Dan carefully inspected every bucket. The pattern was the same, the consistency was the same, but the quantity kept increasing. As they kept going deeper, the layers became even richer. In some pockets, the concentration was so high that a small section alone produced 5 to 6 ounces of gold. This clearly showed that they were slowly getting closer to the main channel. By now, it was clear that Dan Hurd hadn't just found a small spot, but the real question had just begun. How big is this system? Because in mining, the real game isn't just about richness, it's about scale. If the gold is high grade but the area is small, the impact stays limited. But if the same pattern spreads across a large area, then the whole story changes. Dan immediately took the next step, area mapping. Around that location, he started test pits and panning at different points. First 20 to 30 meters, then 50 meters, then 100 meters. Samples were taken from everywhere. Data was collected from every point, and what came out next left the entire team silent. Wherever they dug, the same pattern kept repeating. The same heavy black sand, the same thick gold flakes, and the same high recovery. This wasn't an isolated pocket. It was spreading continuously. When they measured the full stretch, it turned out the system extended about 300 to 400 meters in length. That's roughly the size of 3 to 4 football fields, with similar gold density across the entire area. Dan marked every point in his notebook, results from each test, data from every location. And when he looked at it all together, a clear pattern appeared. This was a continuous buried channel, spreading in a straight line. That meant the system was formed naturally and had remained untouched until now. One of the crew members quietly said, "If it's like this across the whole length, this is going to be huge." And Dan was realizing the same thing. This wasn't a small find. It was an entire gold system. He took a deep breath and said, "This wasn't a spot. This was a whole system." Now the next step was calculation, because numbers are what reveal the true size of a discovery. Dan calculated the average from every test pit. In many places, recovery was around 2 to 3 ounces per cubic yard, and in some richer zones, it even reached up to 4 ounces. He took a conservative approach, assuming an average of 2 ounces per cubic yard, and started the calculations. Now consider the area, about 350 meters long, 20 to 25 meters wide, and an average depth of 3 to 4 meters. When this volume was calculated, the total processable material came out to be in the tens of thousands of cubic yards. Rough estimates showed around 60,000 to 75,000 cubic yards of easily accessible material, and that didn't even include the deeper layers. When this volume was multiplied by the average grade, the numbers started climbing fast. The total recoverable gold estimate came out to be between 120,000 and 150,000 ounces. This was the moment the team truly understood the scale. Now convert that into money. At that time, gold was priced around $2,000 per ounce. On even at the minimum estimate, 120,000 ounces, the value comes to about $240 million. And at the upper range, 150,000 ounces, it goes straight up to $300 million. For a moment, everyone went silent. These weren't numbers from a TV show. This was real ground data. Dan even checked the calculator again. The numbers were the same. No mistake. One crew member laughed and said, "We thought this would be a good season, but this is life-changing." And honestly, it wasn't just a successful mining project. It was a career-defining moment. Dan looked around at the land, then back at his data, and said softly, "This isn't just a discovery anymore. This is a jackpot." But the most interesting part was still left. This entire calculation was based only on surface-accessible material. The deeper layers, the core of the main channel, and the unexplored extensions were still untouched, which means that $300 million estimate might not even be the full story. After seeing such a massive estimate, one thing was clear. There is gold in the ground, and a lot of it. But mining isn't just about finding it. Extracting it is the real challenge. And that's where Dan Hurd's biggest test began, because the place where this entire system was found was just as rich as it was difficult. The first and biggest problem was the location. There was no proper road leading to the site. Even the nearest usable track was about 15 to 20 kilometers away. And beyond that, it was just jungle, rocks, and uneven terrain. Getting heavy machinery there was practically impossible. No big excavators could reach. No heavy trucks either. That meant the kind of large-scale operation usually done in mining simply wasn't possible here. The second challenge was the weather. Mud during the day, cold at night, and sudden bearish that could turn the entire site slippery. Many times the setup would be ready in the morning, and by afternoon, rain would shut everything down. Water flow was unpredictable, sometimes calm, sometimes suddenly strong. This not only slowed the work, but also increased the risk. The third and biggest challenge was manual effort. Since machines were limited, most of the digging had to be done by hand. The crew had to work 8 to 10 hours every day, pulling out heavy gravel, filling buckets, and carrying it to the processing area. In a full day, only about 20 to 25 cubic yards of material could be processed, while large operations handle thousands of cubic yards. When one tired worker said, "The ground is so rich, but getting it out is the hardest part." And that was the truth. The Zameen was giving gold, but every ounce required double the effort. Looking at the whole situation, Dan quietly said, "The bigger the gold, the bigger the challenge. But Dan wasn't someone who would stop. He decided that even if a big setup wasn't possible, a smart setup definitely was. And that's where the real phase of the operation began. Dan set up a compact wash plant system, small, portable, but efficient. It was designed in a way that even with less water and limited power, it could give maximum recovery. Along with that, he started manual sorting and pre-screening so that heavy material could be separated early and processing could be faster. The start was slow, but the results changed everything. Within the first few days, daily recovery reached around 80 to 100 ounces. For such a small setup, these numbers were shocking. A small wash plant, a limited crew, and still an output big enough to outperform many medium-sized operations. As the system got optimized, the numbers kept rising. Some days crossed 120 ounces, and then came the day when peak production touched nearly 150 ounces in a single day. Even the crew couldn't believe it. One of them said clearly, "Such a small setup, and this much output? How is this even possible?" But the answer was simple. The ground was extraordinary, and Dan was extracting it the right way. Dan tracked the numbers every single day, how much material came in, how much gold came out, where losses were happening, and where improvements could be made. He optimized every small detail. Water flow, sluice angle, sorting speed, everything. Slowly, the operation found its rhythm. Now, every day wasn't predictable, but it was powerful. One day, 90 ounces, next day, 110, then suddenly 140. This variability showed that the system still wasn't fully explored. There could be even richer pockets hidden somewhere. Standing near the wash plant, watching the gold flow, Dan said, "Small setup, but big output." But the real thing was, this was just the beginning, because the gold coming out right now was only a part of the entire system. Deeper layers, wider spread areas, and untouched zones were still left. As the numbers kept increasing, along with the excitement, one more thing was rising fast: pressure. Because now this wasn't just a good mining project anymore. It had become a high-stakes operation where every decision could impact millions. For Dan Hurd and his team, every day was no longer just work. It was a calculated risk. The biggest fear was the risk of mistakes. In such rich ground, even a small wrong decision could cause heavy losses. If digging happened in the wrong spot, a valuable layer could be missed. If there was even slight inefficiency in processing, the loss wouldn't be just ounces. It could be dozens of ounces every day. Dan kept reminding the crew again and again, "Every bucket matters here. Even one mistake can cost us thousands of dollars." The second major risk was equipment failure. The setup was small, but the entire operation depended on it. Just one wash plant, limited pumps, and basic machinery. If anything stopped working, the whole operation would come to a halt. Once a water pump suddenly failed and processing stopped immediately. That day, our production dropped almost to zero. Dan tried to arrange a backup system quickly, but because of the remote location, it took 48 hours for a replacement to arrive. In just those 2 days, an estimated 150 to 200 ounces of potential production was lost. The third pressure was financial risk. Even though the discovery was huge, running the operation required constant spending: fuel, transport, crew wages, maintenance. Thousands of dollars were being spent every day, and the return depended completely on daily recovery. If production dropped for a few days, the entire cash flow could be disturbed. Dan knew this clearly. This was a high-reward game, but the risk was just as big. One night during a crew meeting, Dan said clearly, "One wrong decision, and everything is finished." That wasn't an exaggeration. It was reality. And every day required perfect execution, no unnecessary risks, no delays. Balance was the biggest strength of this operation. But as this story started spreading, a whole new level of pressure began: industry reaction. In the Klondike and nearby mining circles, news started spreading that, at a remote location, someone with a small setup was pulling out 100+ ounces daily. At first, people didn't take it seriously. Many experienced miners called it overhyped. Some even said clearly, "These kinds of numbers aren't possible. This is exaggerated." But as consistent reports kept coming, 80 ounces, 120 ounces, even 150 ounces on peak days, curiosity started growing. Some miners even tried to reach the site themselves. Experts began asking Dan to share his data so they could verify whether it was real or not. Verification wasn't easy. The location was remote, access was limited, and conditions were unpredictable. Still, some independent observers managed to do limited checks, gold weighing processes, sample testing, and recovery consistency. And every time the result was the same. The numbers were real. Now disbelief was slowly turning into shock. Comparisons began. While average placer miners usually recover around 20 to 30 ounces per day, Dan's operation was delivering 80 to 100 ounces daily. On peak days, the gap became even bigger. One experienced miner openly said, "We only see numbers like this in large industrial operations, and that too in perfect conditions. Here it's a small setup. How is this even possible?" But the answer was simple. The ground was extraordinary. Some experts were still skeptical. They believed this could be a short-term spike and not sustainable in the long run. But as weeks passed and production remained stable, the doubts started fading. Dan calmly said, "People weren't ready to believe it, but data doesn't lie." And that was the truth. There was no theory here, no guessing, just real numbers. Every day's gold, every cleanup weight, every calculation. It was all proof that this discovery was on a different level. Now, this wasn't just a mining story anymore. It was becoming a benchmark, an example that showed what's possible with the right location, the right understanding, and the right execution, even in the harshest conditions. Even after such massive numbers and consistently strong production, one question kept coming up again and again. Has the entire deposit already been extracted, or is the real treasure still hidden below? Because the gold found so far mostly came from surface and mid-depth layers. The real mystery begins when you look at the deeper signals. When Dan and his team analyzed the excavation data in detail, an interesting pattern appeared. As the depth increased in some areas, the gold concentration didn't decrease, it stayed stable. And in some pockets, it even showed signs of becoming richer. This clearly meant that the system wasn't limited to the upper layers. It could continue deeper underground. In some deeper test pits, around 6 to 8 feet down, heavy gravel layers were found with traces of gold, but they weren't fully extracted. These layers hinted that the core of the main channel might still be lying untouched below. If that's true, then the earlier estimate of 120,000 to 150,000 ounces might only represent the accessible portion. Looking at the data, Dan said clearly, "We've only touched the outer layer. The real system might be even bigger than this." Now the future plan was clear: controlled deeper drilling, targeted excavation, and advanced mapping. The goal wasn't just to pull out gold quickly, but to properly understand the entire system and achieve maximum recovery. Because rushing could mean missing a huge part of it, but deeper digging also meant higher risks, danger of collapse, water flooding, and costs increasing multiple times. That meant every next step had to be taken even more carefully. Standing at the site, Dan looked at the ground below, where signals were still coming from. The numbers had already made history, but the story wasn't over yet. And that's the biggest twist of this entire discovery. Maybe what has been found so far isn't the full story. If this is just the beginning, then imagine how much gold could still be hidden below.